This video is sponsored by Audible. Audible continues to be the home of storytelling with its vast selection of audiobooks, podcasts, and originals. And by going to the link in the description, audible.com/NintendoBC, or texting NintendoBC to 500-500, you'll get a free 30-day trial. We all love a good story. I mean, the whole point of this channel is going into the lore of Zelda. But sometimes it's hard to find the time when our lives are so busy. In fact, I'm willing to bet that some of you guys play my videos as background noise when you do other tasks. And this is where Audible comes in. Each month, Audible gives out 1 credit which can then be exchanged for whatever audiobook you're interested in. Let your imagination run wild, whether it be solving a murder mystery or immersing yourself in a fantasy world. Speaking of fantasy, at the moment I'm listening to A Song of Ice and Fire, the first of many audiobooks in the massively popular Game of Thrones series. It was always my intention to go back and check out the books, and thanks to Audible, I can listen to it while doing other things, like working on videos. So make sure to check out the link in the description, or text NintendoBC to 500-500 for a free 30-day trial. That's audible.com/NINTENDOBC. A couple days ago marked the 9-year anniversary of The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, which was released on November 22nd, 2013 for the Nintendo 3DS. Something I myself was not aware of before writing the script, and can I just say I'm grateful for it, because I literally sat here all day not knowing how to start off this video. Trust me, if you're a YouTuber, you know what I'm talking about. The 3DS era of Zelda was a rather interesting one, as half of the games released were merely remakes of past games. And while the overall reception for ones such as Majora's Mask were rather mixed, I'll always have a soft spot for this era of Zelda. Ocarina of Time 3D was the first Zelda game I ever beat, and it wasn't long until I tried other games, one of those being A Link Between Worlds. It's always been one of those comfort games of mine that I find myself going back to time and time again. Unfortunately, as it's not a quote-unquote mainstream Zelda game, there's not nearly as much content to talk about, especially when it comes to theories. And that makes videos such as this an absolute treat, because I get to talk about one of my favorite games in the series. The story of A Link Between Worlds is a bittersweet one of a kingdom which, very similar to Hyrule, had its own Triforce. One that was destroyed as a means of ending the ongoing conflict and bloodshed. Unfortunately, this decision proved to be fatal, and not long after did Lorule begin to crumble. A Link Between Worlds is a game that takes place long after these events transpired, where we explore a kingdom at death's door, the castle itself barely being held up by the Foundation. A rather fitting image given the circumstances. According to Hilda, her ancestors were the ones to destroy the Triforce, so we know that quite some time has passed, and one brief look at Lorule is more than enough to see the ramifications this choice had, with monsters roaming the land, massive chasms dividing the kingdom, its citizens cowering in fear. And when replaying this game for the 100th time, I couldn't help but remember one interesting bit of lore regarding the citizens, that being the mask cult in Thieves Town, the new name for this world's Kakariko village. The majority of residents reside here, some of them wearing monster-like masks. Naturally, this led me down a rabbit hole, being the curious fellow I am, so let's talk about it. With that said, before we dive deep into the lore bits of this cult, I want to start off with the simplest explanation there is. It's important to remember that this game was released in 2013, 2 years before the Majora's Mask 3D remake. That, combined with the fact that there's a Majora's Mask Easter egg hidden away in Link's house, means that this whole mask cult thing may have only been introduced as a sort of hint towards the 3DS remake. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that any sort of theorizing is pointless since there is lore still surrounding this mask cult, but it's possible that this was Nintendo's primary motive in including it in the first place. Most of the information regarding this cult comes from the Masked Elder, meant to be a Lorulean counterpart to Hyrule's Sahasrahla. Judging from the way he presents himself, it's fair to assume that he holds some sort of authority over the cult, and may even be their leader. Shout out to LoruleanHistorian, who, as always, has provided me with the Japanese quotes used in this video. It's tough in this world, but you mustn't become a thief. It will only corrupt your heart if you become a thief. Humans are filthy. You must believe only in monsters. You too must put on the mask and chant, to be reborn as a monster. Munjara Manjara. Munjara Manjara. Given the context, that last bit seems to be a chant of sorts. In fact, in the localization, the term mumbo-jumbo is used, meant to represent confusing or meaningless language. It may also refer to practices based on superstition, rituals intended to cause confusion, or languages that the speaker does not understand. Again, we can go with the simplest explanation here. It's telling the player that whatever's being spouted by the Masked Elder is nonsense, and the fact that this is cult-related further solidifies that idea. It could also mean that, at this point, Link has stopped paying attention to the words of the Masked Elder and his followers. But the part that's really intriguing is the bit before this chant. According to the Elder, thievery leads to corruption, going on to say that humans are filthy, and that true salvation lies in monsters. To escape this, one needs to don the mask and be reborn a monster. Now, if this were a conversation taking place in Hyrule, it would seem rather ridiculous. However, Lorule was a kingdom sent down an entirely different path, one without a Triforce and therefore without a foundation. Hilda describes it as a chaos that has since reigned. It's what led her to scheme with Yuga to steal Hyrule's Triforce, all for her own people who continue to suffer. Some people believe that Lorule is meant to be the same as A Link to the Past's Dark World, and it makes sense since this game is sort of meant to be a remake of that, and both share the same enemies and overworld design. However, there's a lot of evidence pointing towards the two being different. In A Link to the Past, the Dark World was originally Hyrule's sacred realm. Once Ganondorf got his hands on the Triforce, it took on the appearance based on the greed and evil in his heart, transforming into the Dark World. Rather fitting that I've recently replayed Persona 5 Royal. Anyone who's played that game knows that it uses a similar concept when it comes to palaces and the metaverse. According to the official Zelda timeline, A Link to the Past takes place in the same split as A Link Between Worlds, which happens sometime after. In A Link Between Worlds, we get a faint glimpse of both worlds' sacred realms at the end of the game, and thus can assume that Lorule is different from the Dark World. It's likely that the latter returned to normal at the end of A Link to the Past, and is the same place visited in A Link Between Worlds. Despite this big difference though, both Lorule and the Dark World share similar monster types, which would point towards some sort of connection. However, the origins of each are quite different. Ganon's magic not only affected the appearance of the Sacred Realm, but also everything within it, including people. Some turned into monsters, others animals. The first time Link enters, he's transformed into a rabbit, all because the form one takes depends on their heart, explaining why people such as the bully become monsters, with others taking on radically different forms. In Lorule, most citizens are mirrored versions of the ones found in Hyrule. Many of them have a darker purplish color scheme, such as Princess Hilda. It's likely that this is related to Lorule's current state, and that it has a long-term effect on those that reside there. The massive population of monsters could also be a result of the lack of a Triforce, an imbalance of light and dark, in which chaos is born. In fact, we do have examples of creatures turning into monsters in Lorule. Link can find the Lorulean counterpart of the man under the bridge in Hyrule, who goes on to state that the little birds transformed into monsters, and that he himself tried to become a monster by wearing a mask and chanting, as a means of getting closer to the yellow-winged monsters. So perhaps the people of Lorule believe that the monsters are living a happier life, and therefore see themselves as inferior or corrupt beings. There's even the possibility that some residents transformed into monsters while others remained human. At the very least, some of these monsters appear to be somewhat intelligent, capable of speaking and having different personalities. One cave in Lorule has a cowardly Hinox who begs the hero to spare his life in exchange for rupees. There's also an Octorok hanging out with some kids who set up a baseball minigame. The Octorok participates in the game and even has dialogue. One of these kids is also wearing a mask. Plus, we have the Treacherous Tower, a 50-level arena where the hero battles against numerous enemies, the spectators being monsters of Lorule. It seems that this is a source of entertainment for them, and there are even residents of Thieves' Town who allegedly take part in this challenge. With all this information, it's not hard to believe that some may have transformed into monsters, while others are left with a desire to become them. At the very least, it seems that both human and monster have some sort of connection with one another, and that it's not entirely of malice or hatred. Perhaps Link is attacked because he's considered an outsider, as he comes from an entirely different world. Of course, it's also possible that the residents wear these masks because they're afraid of the monsters. By doing so, they blend in with them so that they aren't attacked. Though, personally speaking, there's a lot more evidence to imply the former rather than the latter. At first I assumed this transformation into monsters was the result of a long-term effect on Lorule and its people. But let's take another look at one of the quotes. If this individual knows that the birds were transformed into monsters, it means that, at some moment in his life, they were once normal. Therefore, it must have happened recently. But the question now is, when? If the player goes to the location that would be Lorule's sanctuary, a philosopher can be found in a cave. When pondering on how long it's been since he's seen light, he states that it's been 3 years, or an eternity. But the addition of that last bit makes you question whether the 3 years mentioned are accurate or just a random number thrown out there. Luckily, we have translations of the Japanese version. While the philosopher doesn't mention anything close to that eternity line, once again there's that 3 years. And this version makes him sound a lot more confident in his answer. This lines up perfectly with our previous quote, meaning that it's possible the transformation into monsters occurred approximately 3 years ago. Hilda's ancestors may have been the ones to destroy the Triforce, but perhaps these drastic changes to Lorule happened only recently. In fact, this might have been the time the chasms formed. The philosopher goes on to state that the people have lost their faith in the gods, a deduction based on the fact that no one visits a sanctuary, but in reality, no one would be able to get there in the first place. Dumpe even mentions that it's been forever since someone has talked to him. But we can take this thought process a step further. According to Hilda, Yuga discovered a crack in Lorule's sacred realm connecting it to Hyrule, and thus both schemed to take their Triforce. Now, we're never given a time frame of when this happened, but what if it occurred 3 years ago, around the time people turned into monsters and darkness fell upon the land? That would mean this plan of Hilda's was in the works for several years, which is a lot more believable than it being something the pair immediately thought of. With that said, let's go back to the cult. I can't help but feel that there's hypocrisy in the Masked Elder's words. Perhaps it was purposely placed there to further sell the chaotic state of Lorule and its effect on the citizens. The whole point of donning the mask was to be reborn as a monster rather than resorting to thievery and corrupting oneself. To some extent, this logic is sound. In a crumbling world, many would go down this path out of desperation. A handful of people throughout Thieves' Town have already become thieves, and eventually Link winds up in their hideout in search of one of the sages, where he fights the boss of the thieves. One would think that this individual was human, given the Elder's speech on corruption. However, what lies at the end of this dungeon is actually a monster. This shatters any sort of credibility the Masked Elder's words may have once had, further closing the gap between human and monster. This isn't something that necessarily changes anything said in this video, it's more so an observation. But it does show how, regardless of whether one chooses to wear a mask to be reborn as a monster or heads down the path of thievery, both lead to a similar endpoint: a world ruled by monsters. In addition, there's the Dark Palace, which is guarded by soldiers who were once part of Lorule Castle. However, according to Hilda, they soon believed in the power of evil and took up residence in the temple, described as a den for those who worship demonic beasts. The sentries stationed all throughout the maze also wear mask-like searchlights, which resemble the shape of the Gemmasaur King. The name Dark Palace itself is also rather fitting, believed to once be the Eastern Palace, now enveloped in a cloak of darkness, much like Lorule itself. So, what's the takeaway here? The simplest answer is that the masked cult was created as a response to Lorule's chaotic state. Perhaps things took a turn for the worse a few years ago with the sudden appearance of monsters and a lack of faith. The people believed that the gods had forsaken them, and that the only choices were to succumb to thievery and therefore become corrupted, or to follow the ways of the monsters for salvation. If the scheme to take Hyrule's Triforce began a few years ago, it's even possible that Hilda or Yuga had some influence in the formation of this cult. Why exactly they'd do that, I don't know. It's more so speculation on my part. Maybe it was so that a hero would rise against Yuga for the sake of obtaining the Triforce of Courage. When you really think about it, Hilda's plan to steal the relic doesn't really make sense. Link couldn't have been part of the original plan since the only reason he got involved was because of Ravio and his bracelet, and I highly doubt Hilda anticipated that. I can only assume that the original plan was to wait for a hero to appear, rescue the sages, and restore the Triforce of Courage. Yuga was tasked with getting the other two from Ganon and Zelda, and while he did have the sages in his possession, if that's all that was needed to get the piece, there'd be no point in sending Link out on his adventure. But again, this leads into mere speculation, and it's not what this video is about. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you thought of this topic. I don't get many chances to talk about this game, which is a real shame since it's one of my favorites, so I had a lot of fun writing this one, and to be honest, I feel like I could have written more, but it was also a theory I really struggled with putting into words. So I hope I was able to present it in a way that felt coherent. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.